Along with master politicians like James Farley and Louis Howe, the president surrounds himself with bright young college professors, such as Raymond Moley, Rexford Guy Tugwell, and Adolph Burley, men who generate new ideas and new policies. They are the brain trust of the Roosevelt Revolution.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic is in the digitosphere in the ever-growing, ever-expanding, ever-radical TMBS universe. On this week's program, Daniel Bessner. He is author of Rise of the Defense Intellectuals, a professor at the University of Washington in foreign policy. We're talking about breaking the imperialist consensus. What does a socialist foreign policy look like? What can we do to stop the slaughter in Yemen? And the rise of the think tank intellectual and how it relates to our world today. He's going to be here in studio. We got to shout out Kyrie Irving. He's got something to teach all of us. And no, I've not embraced the flat earth theory. Sad to say. Labor unions in the moves against Kavanaugh will check in as another reason to not confirm a endlessly lying, almost certain predator to the Supreme Court. Plus, we have a Griscom economic minute. We have a Leck regulate, and so much more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. And of course, a gulag, which we have now moved to the post game. You got to be a patron to get it. All that and much more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. Thank you one and all for being here. Let's start by talking about environmental refugees. If you're like me, your image of environmental refugees are people from developing countries who are disproportionately on the receiving end of the climate crisis as it is already enacted in our world. From small island nation states to Bangladesh to other areas that have been afflicted by everything from hurricanes to drought to disrupted agricultural cycles. We know that poverty and climate are interlinked. And we also should know that, as Joshua Kahn, who is a regular on this program and a global climate activist, that there's a distinction between climate justice and climate policy. They're not necessarily the same thing. There's many paths towards techno and economic fixes to the climate crisis that don't do durable things to deal with the justice equation of what the climate crisis is. Let's reorient ourselves in some of the facts about where we're at in terms of the climate crisis. This is from NASA. Average sea levels have risen by 7 to 8 inches since 1900. Almost half has occurred since 1993. Since 1900, average temperature in the U.S. has increased by 1.8 Fahrenheit. From 2021 to 2050, it's expected to rise about 2.5 Fahrenheit. Drought is more likely to earlier spring melt and reduce snowpack in the western U.S. with a significant reduction in emissions. Annual average global temp could be limited to a rise of 3.6 Fahrenheit. This is going to lead to an increase in droughts, wildfires, and all of the other things that we already see playing out with climate. And it's also introducing us to a new sector of climate refugee, which are the wealthy, the privileged. There's a report from The Guardian about people in Arizona, more affluent members of Phoenix, moving to Flagstaff, where they don't have to deal with regular above 100-degree days. They're leaving an unbearable city because they have the financial ability to do so. And many climate fixes are predicated on this scenario of those with the wealth and the access and the capacity to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change, which of course have been disproportionately created by those in the wealthier part of the supply chain. Look at the elitist prepper fantasies of Silicon Valley and Peter Thiel. Look at the plans to live in bunkers in New Zealand and escape the fallout of a global crisis spurred by climate, infectious diseases, and other global ecological catastrophes. There is a way to address this that doesn't center class or justice. Jerry Brown, who's doing some very important things as governor of California, is a great example of this. There's very little interest in his approach to dealing with the climate crisis that has to do with environmental racism, that has to do with the effects of drilling and fracking on local communities, that has to do with a broad-based, union-heavy, bottom-up path of resiliency for all communities. But there is one focused on techno-fixes, innovation, and building resiliency out so that people dealing with the effects of climate change can buy into another luxury brand to escape from the crisis. That's what we see playing out in Arizona. That's what we see in the prepper industry out of Silicon Valley. And we really could see a dealing with climate and a sense of resiliency that, as I say, is another luxury brand and opt-in versus a globally integrated movement to deal with the climate crisis in and of itself and all of its humanitarian consequences. We can't do that without centering class in the equation and dealing with the longer-term, big-picture contradiction between ecological limits and insatiable capitalist appetite. It's impossible to reconcile, but it is possible in some ways to make dealing with the consequences of climate another class distinction, and that's already happening. And if we don't have a radically different approach to dealing with the climate crisis that is labor, class focused, and fully integrated with a broader set of justice concerns, we will replicate all of the same cultural and economic pathologies in the climate realm as we have everywhere else. Guys, if you want to jump in, please do. That is the opening, which time is tightening up on those. That's good.
Yeah, it's when you're looking at the climate crisis, I mean, there's really no way that we can talk about dealing with it without talking about very serious public solutions.
Right.
You talk about something even as simple as making public transportation more accessible and free and better.
Right.
That's something that could be, have a huge impact on the amount of, carbon that we're expelling through driving. I mean, think about like a high-speed rail system throughout the United States that was able to connect, even just the corridor between Washington, D.C. to Boston.
Yep.
Think about the amount of people that live through there, and think about how many cars you could pull off the road. But these kind of solutions require serious, public support, and they also require serious public mobilization, which is something that privatization and the past few years of neoliberalism and capitalism have really prevented. Instead, we have individual solutions to a global and community problem, which is not going to work, because what you see is what's happening in Arizona, where all these people, are literally sweltering to death, right? Because, cooling is still seen as something that's a luxury product. And then the wealthy are just getting up and out of town. Like, that's not a solution that's going to work at all. And it's not a solution that's going to be able to face the immense challenge that was created through the greed of a few people over the past 50, 60 years.
And also the idea that this is about individual consumption also does the flip side, where it becomes like a hair shirt thing. Like, having an air conditioner, that's a real luxury. You're telling people who are sitting in 100-degree weather and maybe don't have the ability to move around, and on top of everything else, there was, heat waves, people dying in Europe, certainly in India, that, no, you don't need an air conditioner. That's a personally profligate thing, right? Versus, first of all, none of these things are going to be solved by any type of individual consumer decision, period. And the attitude that it's about individual consumer decisions actually does tend to, fall radically disproportionately on the poor, right? Like, somebody who's wealthy, maybe they're taking a fast for like a spiritual exercise or for their health. Somebody who's homeless is not eating because they don't have food.
Yeah, and speaking of the spiritually profligate, it sort of, what Griscom said especially, it's, people when they want to defend Elon Musk say, there's certain interesting engineering things, and at least he's doing this electric car stuff because nobody else was doing that. which, however much you could disagree with those, we don't necessarily need that, right? The personal automobile, I think, has been disastrous as any technology maybe we've ever had. So, I don't know if I necessarily want that to be made work. And I guess you could say, a public body would maybe try to do the same thing, and it could be, they're going to try to make electric cars when maybe we should do more mass transport type of things. But I'd rather do that democratically than, expect some private individual to make this work in a corporate scenario.
Yeah. It's a second order thing. Even those engineering breakthroughs, even if they produced what they promised, would still be a secondary part of the solution in any sensible scenario. And even with the most energy efficient cars imaginable, you still cannot have and this is where it's very hypocritical and it's tough, because it's okay, I understand the hypocrisy of American consumers saying, okay, if China has a middle class with everybody has a car on the road like the United States, nobody can breathe on this planet. And I don't care how efficient the car is and how many miles it gets. The production, manufacturing, and emissions process of even the cleanest vehicles that we can see in our foreseeable future are going to essentially just submerge the planet in smog. And obviously, there's a big hypocrisy factor of people in the United States being oh, okay, well, now it's time to stop, right? After we've exhausted and depreciated everything. But the reality is that there's no silver bullet to any of these things that's going to come from the supply, market, or engineering side. And a lot of the solutions that we already know of to these things are things like mass transit, which of course we can innovate them. We should have bullet trains and do all sorts of things that we're already way behind places like Japan and Europe in, but they're not these new magical out there scenarios. They're things that we already know work and have already been the basic conflict of how we just get around and deal with having less emissions.
And expecting, here's the fundamental thing, and, something I'd say to people all the time is that you just can't expect the logic of the system to work in in a new way than it has for the past 100 years. The profit-based model might produce certain kind of environmentally friendly cars, friendly in compared to the worst emissions that you can imagine, right? But only in so much as that they're able to extract a level of profit from that, which is not necessarily they don't get the value from the total social good. They get the value from the individual purchaser who's buying that car and saying, oh, I'm feeling a little bit better about what I'm doing for the environment. And I'm not saying that that's not a good thing, at all, but to deal with the major solutions, we need to have real structural understandings of how we're interacting with the world, and that means for organizations that are working on transport questions, which are car companies, for example, having more initiative and more incentive for them, right, to be looking to the environment as a whole outside of just trying to compete against other car companies on the market.
Yeah,
right?
And the notion of mobility writ large versus just car.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. It's so you need that kind of push that's going to be outside of the sort of market of capitalism that's sort of telling companies what they need to do. And the first thing that companies are always going to do, no matter what they say, is going to try to find ways to make profit. And that's the number one goal, and that's the way the logic of this system. So waiting for a free market solution to the climate crisis, it's going to be something we're going to be waiting for Godot with that one. I mean, seriously, we're at a moment now where we're at such critical levels that without real concerted effort and without possibly even some pain on some levels for us, we will not have a livable climate in our, even in our lifetime, certainly not, for our children.
For any possible children, right.
And it's, something that we really need to take seriously, and you can't wait to expect that, the market is going to be able to innovate its way out of the problem and the crisis that it created, because it was exactly by following the logic of the market and of capitalism in general that has created the conditions for this crisis. And you're not going to be able to break out of that without some kind of force that really disrupts that entire structure.
Actual disruption. Let's get to the shout out and give somebody some props who,
and we're back.
I even defended him when I guess he didn't deserve props, frankly.
I don't want to be greedy, but if Anarchy could give us a shout out beat, that
Kyrie
would be
Irving. Matt, this was your pick.
Let's get to
I didn't know that you didn't give him props.
No, I did give him props when he was saying the Earth was flat.
Why were you doing that?
Because I thought it was funny. Because I liked the rap music it inspired. This is out of control.
That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird. Shout out.
Damn, where's Alex Jones? Kyrie Irving is a great basketball player, and he, about a year ago, it was only like a year ago, right? 2 years ago?
Yeah, I'd say about a year ago, maybe.
Year ago. He had some, he's also, I don't know if he's still a vegan, but he had some vegan brain going on. All love to vegan listeners.
Looks like
viewers.
February 2017.
He was on this, and honestly, like, I guess I trolled it a little bit. I didn't realize that this flat earth thing was such a big thing until Kyrie Irving came out with it. He's a really good basketball player. And like many athletes, and he points out in this clip, he's a super young dude. And I actually just like this example. We just wanted to highlight this example of, and this could be applied to so many things, of just any public figure just copying to making a mistake in a non-egoic and non-defensive manner and keeping it moving.
Yeah, this was at the Monday. This was speaking Monday at the Forbes Under 30 Summit in Boston. So
the Forbes Under 30 Summit.
You know, Forbes is like, what's that business about?
Yeah, what's the real the flat Earth, right? Yeah.
You said you're joking, and then you weren't joking. So which is it? Which side are you on?
Well, I mean, hopefully after this, I'm done answering.
Good. Let's clear it up for good. You never have to be asked again.
Clear it up for good. I mean, people are gonna ask me regardless, but I think the like what you say and what you do and how you mean it. At the time, I was like huge into conspiracies. Everybody's been there. Everybody's been there. Like, yo, what's going on with our world? You know, like you click a YouTube click and it goes like how deep the rabbit hole goes. It's like, yo, you start telling all your friends like, yo, did you see that? Did you watch this video? I'm telling you, and it was. You know, at the time, it was like, you're like innocent in it, but you realize the effect of the power of voice, and even if you believe in that, it's like, you're like, well, don't come out and say that stuff. That's for intimate conversations, because perception, how you're received, it just changes. Like, no, I'm actually a smart-ass individual. Like, no, it's just, like, so it's not like, it's not like I was just coming out and saying that. So it was like, at the time, just didn't realize the effect, and I was definitely at that time, like, I'm a big conspiracy theorist, you can't tell me anything. Right. So yeah, I'm sorry about all that, you know, for all the science teachers, everybody coming up to me like, you know, I gotta reteach my whole curriculum. I'm sorry. I apologize. I apologize.
I love the pushback from the science teachers. I actually love the image of like a middle school science teacher going up and being like, dude, you're destroying my profession by putting this nonsense on Instagram and Twitter. Like, excuse you, you putz.
Yeah, and
but that's cool. He carried that perfectly. He reminded you, he's like, look, I'm human. Sorry, I spread it, and let's keep it moving.
And I actually think we can be too chicken little when it comes to how dangerous, like, say, our current media environment is with this stuff.
Yes.
Because I think people have always been able to go down rabbit holes. I actually think it's harder to maintain a cult's sort of sphere of impenetrability. Jeez, I can't speak.
Impenetrability.
And, you know, like we were saying earlier, in any given question with a large enough sample size, like 7 billion people on Earth, there's going to be a certain number of people that are going to be like, fuck you, I don't want to take your word for it. And I'm going to, like, take this opposite forking path that, like, is now available to me. But I actually think that the internet makes those harder to maintain over longer periods of time. You need to throw more junk at people. But, like, I don't think people stay on them. This is just a hypothesis.
No, I think it's true in terms of it's some information, at least anecdotally, about cults as an example. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder to maintain that if somebody can go on Google and
cults
see,
are
like,
all about
the
controlling
abuse
the
of the leaders, the debunking of story. That's a common. I'm forgetting it. I'm listening for 30 for 30. No, I'm some new. I forget his name. A big yoga guru. All sorts of abuse. I'm listening to a podcast on it. Bikram. Right? And that's another thing. It was like, just even relative to 2002, or 2008. Like, there's just more people who look things up.
Yeah. I mean, cult literally,
Yeah.
you needed to control the culture of it.
Right. Exactly. I am curious, though. What conspiracy theory have you guys gone in the deepest on? I'm going to think of which one I have, too, while you tell me. I just honestly can't. Probably because the conspiracy theories that I believe in, I probably still believe in. So I'm trying to think of a good one that I've moved past.
Oh, one that I moved past? Oh, because
well, actually, no. It could be either way. What's one you've either moved past or you still are like, you know what? I stand by it.
I think there's definitely been a cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And I think probably if all was known, you would have CIA, mafia, and the Cubans involved and stuff like that.
So can I give you my, because I get in trouble because I think Kennedy one is one of the ones where I'm actually like the most like, I don't know that I necessarily believe the reports of the Warren Commission, but I'm not that conspiratorial about it in some ways. And partially I'm not because I'm not terribly convinced that JFK really did have, until maybe towards the end. I understand his rhetoric shifted, but he was a cold warrior and he was pretty good to go for most of his career. So it seems like was really the Bay of Pigs and a couple of speeches enough for the whole apparatus to flip on him like that?
It's hard to know. Like that stuff is the interesting question of it. I mean, I've read one book that Bobby Kennedy Jr. wrote a blurb on for the back. So
that is right.
But I've read it. It's kind of by this Catholic theologian guy. It's a bit out there, but it's fairly interesting. But he says it was because of Kennedy's attitude towards African national movements. So like the Patrice Lumumba killing and things like that. They realized he couldn't be. And who knows? I mean, there was a lot of the Cuba stuff, the Bay of Pigs thing. I mean, the Bay of Pigs shit is so insane.
That pissed a lot of people off.
Yeah, I mean, and that was that was basically
that's that illicit history advantage you get on this show. Bay of Pigs.
I mean, if you look at it, you look at it from the perspective of Kennedy might have stolen that election.
Might have literally stolen it, but he also ran to the right.
Right,
on the missile gap.
Exactly, and the missile gap possibly was a result of discussion with the Dulles brothers. Like they tipped him off on that stuff, and then he wins it, but by a razor-thin margin. You have this entire state apparatus that thought it was Eisenhower's, right? Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, and they thought Nixon was just going to roll in. Nixon was leading the Bay of Pigs from the White House because Eisenhower had the heart attacks. Right. So they were ready to go, and then Kennedy goes in. It's very strange because it's hard to know like what the Dulles brothers were doing there. It's hard. It's impossible really to know a lot of this stuff.
And then Kennedy lets the Bay of Pigs go forward. It's a disaster, and then he actually instead of being like what almost every post-Kennedy leader would do, which is be like, you guys had a catastrophic mess up. What can I do? His attitude actually does change to at least in those recordings where he's like, "The fuck are you guys doing?" Yeah,
he's pissed off, and it looks like the Bay of Pigs, from a certain angle, it looks like it was set up to prompt a full ground invasion of Cuba. By us.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
That's definitely my.
And Kennedy didn't do that.
Kennedy didn't.
So there was you left those guys on the beach to get murdered, like sort of.
And then Ted Cruz's dad comes.
And then and then activate Rafael Cruz. To go down to New Orleans and try to build up Oswald's cover as a communist, and then
And then there we go. All right, Griscom, what's your conspiracy theory?
Well, this is a conspiracy theory that the first time I heard, I was very wide-eyed. Have you ever heard of the Solutrean hypothesis before?
No.
So this is one that they basically found.
Sounds good.
They found all of these arrowheads in Newfoundland.
Newfoundland?
Right? Yeah. No. Yeah.
Newfoundland.
Yeah. In Canada,
northeastern Canada.
Okay, I don't even. All right,
and they
Sorry,
they were very similar to arrowheads that were found in southern Spain and southern France.
Mm-hmm.
So there became this whole theory that came about that maybe the Native Americans didn't come from Asia, that they actually came from Europe.
Very testy.
And I had a professor who was a big adherent of it, and it was like in college, and he was explaining it to me, and I remember thinking, like, wow, this is so interesting, like, this lost history. And then, so I was like, oh, wow. And then when I talked to one of my friends at university who's a Native American activist, I was like, have you ever heard of this before? They're like,
yes, asshole.
They're like, you mean that Nazi crap?
Right, right.
And I found out that it's like, just like all of those hypotheses that always try to, turn the gaze back to Europe. It was definitely like propagated by a bunch of Nazis.
If I might ask? Do you remember?
I can't remember his name, but he was an actual maniac.
Did he? Right. Did he have tenure?
No, he was an adjunct professor, which is really, which is really funny, just because usually you think that the adjunct professors are always so afraid of getting in trouble.
Right. I was going to say, I would think that the sort of terrors of neoliberalism would keep that sort of thing in check.
He goes by @BallsOutAdjunct online.
There were a few people, I think, early on in like promoting
adjunct. I don't care.
Who I don't think had sympathies, but once they started being able to do, genetic testing and other things that sort of like proved it was completely, nonsense. The only people who are still holding on to it were weirdos who sort of think that there was an actual cover up,
right?
Which is, absolute nonsense. But no, I don't have any good alien.
I've got one that I've since shed, but it might come back around. It was right when I first got the internet.
Right.
And I went online, and I have no idea how I happened across this. It was like one of those geo sites where it's on like a white background that like it's like wallpaper and then the Comic Sans font over it. Anyway, this big long thing about how elites were building an ark in the Rocky Mountains.
That's happening.
It's happening,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
like that's the thing.
That's one of those ones that's like take it literal seriously, but not literally.
Yeah, exactly. But
right,
you know what?
like that's not happening. But Peter Thiel's buying a bunker in New Zealand.
I'll tell you how literally I took it. Is I
Yeah.
printed out about 35 pages, and I brought it to my German class in 7th grade. And I decided to show it to my German teacher, Frau Martin, who I had a bit of a crush on, and she looked at it and she's just like, okay, good.
All right, that's great. Kid who has a crush on me is printing out geosites pages now. That's wonderful.
Oh, wait, this is very important, actually. I did remember one.
Okay, go ahead.
So I remember very quickly when I was a young boy in Austin, Texas, flipping through the television
that was
channels.
very Alex Jones of you. I remember I was a young boy in Austin, Texas.
Flipping through the television channels, and I ended up on the public access channel.
Right.
And a very important discovery was being talked about was, Arnold Schwarzenegger is very likely to run for president. I don't know when this was, maybe in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And the person on television was very worried about this. And he was giving us dire warnings about how the founding fathers very much purposefully put in the naturalized citizens clause into the Constitution to prevent the Austrians.
Specifically the Austrians.
From coming into our country and taking over and returning it to the monarchy. And it was going on. I was thinking, oh my God, this is terrible. And, this Arnold Schwarzenegger is coming, to destroy the republic. I must have been like 8 or 9 or something.
I'm the king now.
Schwarzenegger's coming out to take over the republic. And this guy was very passionate, screaming at the television. Only later did I learn that man's name. That man's name, Alex Jones.
Yes. Beautiful. I'm trying to think of one. I mean, I totally believe the Randall Sullivan reporting on basically a rogue unit of the LAPD killing Biggie. I pretty much totally and some of that still holds up. There were all these cops that some of them were part of the Ramparts division, which did have this it was an anti-gang division in the LAPD, and it was I think there was a federal investigation of it for killing people, planting drugs. It's what Training Day is based off of. And some of those guys in off-duty hours worked security for Death Row Records, and some of them were actually members of the Pyro Bloods while they were also cops. And there's this whole rabbit hole about basically this LAPD, it's actually kind of tragic. This guy Henry Poole, he basically, I'm sure I'm going to offend people by saying this, but he basically lost his mind. He quit LAPD because he thought there was a massive cover-up, and then he did a civil suit with Biggie's mother for the whole city of Los Angeles. And again, there's some truth to it, but he also had a pattern that he really wanted to see. So it was sort of a story of kind of obsession too. But I totally, until there, I mean, there was some like Occam's razor stuff that came out about that kind of made more sense. But I bought that, and there still is like an element. It's like one of the things. It's like there is some truth to this. Like there were cops.
And I always think like, why the fuck do you think you should get the benefit of the doubt? Like in the Gary Webb CIA cocaine stuff, it's like. I
believe that stuff 100%.
Well, the only thing
I think the Gary Webb stuff's pretty.
The only thing that's quibbled with is that I guess Gary Webb himself even didn't say it was like a main driver or whatever, right? So it's degree, but like, what are we arguing about at that point?
Yeah, and also I think that there's like, what are we arguing about? And there's also like, he identified one route. I think there were like, the reality was it's not this like. The Contras used cocaine to fund their war, and basically the question is like, does it mean that like the CIA personally packaged vials up to deliver in South Central? No, that's probably where you get more conspiratorial. But did they like know for a fact that it was happening, and I'm sure interfere with other agency investigations to protect known traffickers? Like, of course, that's just, I mean. And that's across the board. I mean, that's in Afghanistan, that's in Vietnam. Like, drugs make you liquid. Like, and the CIA works with liquid. Like, you're looking to organize a death squad in a developed country. Where do you think you're going to get money for that from? Right?
Yeah. Well, which queen was it? Where she was basically like the opium. When the British Empire was basically like the opium dealer.
Oh, right. When they forced opium on the Chinese. I don't remember which queen, but like, yeah, it's just that stuff's just economics. And speaking of just economics, let's actually, you know what? We got to get to our Lek and Grisham segments. As I said before. The Gulag is going to be moved to the post game as another added bonus incentive for people to become patrons. But I want to play this. Brett Kavanaugh is lying. And, we know this. He's almost certainly a perjurer, even on some of the most perjuring himself on the trivial stuff, not like the horrifying assault allegations against him. And this is all still in the context of somebody who will be a corporate bagman on the Supreme Court. There were great protests across the country yesterday on just even the notion that someone with these accusations and with this record and without an FBI investigation, the notion that the Republicans are still moving him through is, of course, utterly misogynist and horrifying. There's another component to this as well, which also needs to be in the mix, and that are these DSA or teachers unions, West Virginia teachers unions organizers, talking with Joe Manchin. David Slavic sent it. You don't have that email. If you can find it, that would be great. Sorry if we're disrupted, but basically we're going to find that in a second. But they're on a speaker call with, you know what, I think I just retweeted it. You can find it on my Twitter timeline. They're on a speaker call with Senator Joe Manchin. The Senator Joe Manchin, of course, the very far right-wing Democratic senator from Virginia, who is threading a needle on this. The reality is, of course, that West Virginia, Trump's very popular. Manchin has regularly voted for every type of reactionary and corporate and, of course, coal interest imaginable. But he is still a Democrat in West Virginia. And he still is also a Democrat in West Virginia where there's a little bit of an upsurge of grassroots energy. There was the amazing teacher strikes. You got a guy like Richard Ojeda running a real rigorous populist campaign for Congress. And Manchin needs to listen. This is actually very well done of these union members telling Manchin the even additional stakes of having a far-right corporate Republican operative on the Supreme Court.
My reason for not making any announcement now is because I'm the one that asked for an investigation.
Right.
How hypocritical would that be for me to come out one way or another before I see the findings of the investigation. That doesn't make any rationale or sense whatsoever.
I think it makes perfect sense because what we've been saying all day, Senator, is that we don't need an FBI investigation to
Well, everybody
know,
else in the country needs one.
Well, we don't need an FBI investigation, and you should not need an FBI investigation to know that Brett Kavanaugh is bad for women and is bad for Americans, quite frankly. We know, even before the assault allegations, we know where Brett Kavanaugh stands on reproductive rights. We know where Brett Kavanaugh stands on health care. We know where Brett Kavanaugh stands on unions. And he stands directly opposed to all of those things. And speaking from someone who is a sexual assault survivor, who is a union member, who is a teacher who just went on strike with workers who were 74% women against austerity. If you really were with us, Senator, you would know how to vote already, and you would have known how to vote in June when he was announced, because he's anti-union.
Don't you believe in the rule of law?
He's consistently.
This is a country of the rule of law.
I believe in looking at a judge's voting record and seeing that when he votes consistently against unions every single time and sides with bosses and corporations, that man is my class enemy, and he stands against working class women and working class people. And if you stand with us, you are going to vote no on him. And you don't need an FBI investigation to tell you that. So if you stand with workers, if you just stand with working class West Virginians, which the whole state of West Virginia is working class, Senator Manchin, you're going to vote no on Kavanaugh. So tell us yes or no. What is it? Is it yes or no?
Let's have a little respect here. I'm going to vote what the facts show me. I haven't heard the facts. I haven't seen the facts from this investigation.
So he just blew past all of her points, and she's exactly right. If he is with them, he votes no, period, on the fact that Brett Kavanaugh is absolutely, as she said, he is a class enemy, in addition to, of course, being an enemy of women, an enemy of anybody with any need for recourse and justice in society. And this rule of law thing has nothing to do with anything. That's spin and manners and bullshit. And that's great pressuring. Hopefully it comes through. Although I'm pretty scared about how Manchin votes on this. I think it essentially will just be headwind from Flake. And then we'll see what Collins and Murkowski come with. But, of course, as any guy, as he still likes to do, he still likes to pose as something of a West Virginia populist. This was a no vote in June, just as Emily said. You should become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. There's a massive amount of content you get. We have a friend in here, a patron visiting us tonight. Someone who has been a steady and rigorous critic of my excellent taste in rap music, including even at times that aren't even real. One time he accused me of liking Drake, which is a falsehood. We have the Illicit History series this Sunday, Megan Day on the history of ultra elites and tax shelters. Last weekend, Luke Savage on the reactionary truth underneath all of the maple washing about Canadian politics. We do a lot of global stuff, a lot on Europe, the Middle East, of course, a lot of coverage recently on the crisis and possibility in Brazil, as well as primers on different political theorists and policy areas. There's a theory discussion group and with David Griscom. There's a thriving, fully activated 24/7 Discord community. And of course, there's Woke Bros with Big Waz and myself. It's the beginning of the month. Please make sure. It's very frustrating. There's definitely a lot of issues with card declines and stuff for some reason on our Patreon. So it's always a really depressing beginning of the month when you hit a certain number and then there's just this huge fall off, most of which is just people having trouble with their banks. So just check up on everything. Sorry that Patreon's so annoying, but make sure everything is squared away. And if you haven't done it yet, join us at patreon.com/TMBS. Go to the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Subscribe to it. Great way to follow, share, and seed the content. You can follow all of us on Twitter as well as, of course, all of the guests. There's links to that as well. And now it is time for the pestilence, the strategic pestilence of Matt Leck with Regulate with Matt Leck. This new YouTube regimen is disgusting, man.
It really is.
Disgusting.
I mean, that should be the Regulate.
And it is
How they so
counterproductive.
transparently pull the plug right when they're like they were helping us steal music, right? Like that's what they were sort of doing by
Literally.
their copyright things, because it helped them attack things like Pandora or
Spotify. Yep.
And then now exactly. That's
And we have to follow up to see what role Leor Cohen is playing all of this, because I do think he's involved in YouTube music. And Leor Cohen, I'm going Dame Dash interpretation on Leor Cohen. Fuck Leor Cohen.
This is a theme I think we've touched on before, but not in the Regulate segment, which is how conservatives get upset with double standards, as if statements are made in a sort of vacuum that the meaning can be extracted from objectively by scientists. So there, Ari Fleischer, who is not a good person,
Who is a terrible person, should not be in any public respectable company, prime propagandist for the invasion of Iraq.
tweeted out this story about Beto O'Rourke. This will be a one-day story because Beto is a Democrat. If a Republican wrote this in college, women's groups would protest and the press wouldn't let it go. That's how it works. It's a double standard. What he's upset with is Beto reviewed a play when he was 19 in college and said that I think the worst thing was some of the actresses maybe wouldn't have gotten those jobs if they didn't have large breasts. You know, it was a crass thing for a 19-year-old to say. I don't know that it necessarily should be a multi-day story. But the thing is it's not really about what was said. That's not the only thing that matters. The logos of a statement is not the only thing that matters.
Right.
As those of us who love our Western civilization like to point out, Aristotle had ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is your credibility and your works that go into how people are going to judge your performance in rhetoric. So, for instance, if Beto was like anti-Roe, for instance,
right.
Yeah, women's groups probably would be hitting him with these statements.
If Ted
more
Cruz
often.
wrote this would fit
exactly
with who Ted Cruz is.
If the shoe fits, you got to wear it.
Right.
And I was thinking about this on the way in. I was doing a little thought experiment where it's like, yeah, like let's say you had...
Got to Perry Mason that shit.
There are two people in the world. There's two people in the world, okay? This might be a bit too abstract, but they're in this room and there's a chair, and in between them there's a piece of parchment that says, all men are created equal. Now, what that means is going to depend on who you put in those chairs, right? If it's Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they know, like, yeah, we know what that means.
Yeah, right,
okay?
right.
If it's like James Baldwin and, Eleanor Roosevelt, it's going to mean something else.
It's going to mean something quite different.
And that's really, I think, we have this explosion of media and communication and all this stuff. And we really need to get this understanding that meaning is socially constructed. And it's up to us, basically. And attempts to occlude that fact are basically just exercises of power, or trying to cloak exercises of power.
I'm not going to get into it, but also witness Sam Harris.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
all those
that's it.
things.
All of that stuff.
Because, Hitchens got onto that because he always says the 21st century is going to be against the literal versus the ironic mind. And I think that's true. I think he focused too much on the religious fundamentalism, because what Sam Harris does with biology or IQ and those things, those are the same sort of fundamentalist pursuits, right? They're looking to drill down to find something that they can explain everything with. And that's not what it's about.
That's not what it's about at all. And it also puts you like in this platonic realm where you're not subject to history or context.
Yep.
And I actually like religious language in the sense of like we're all fallen humans. I think that's actually an incredibly humbling and accurate stance for us all to hold across the board, because it's like, I mean, just definitionally, we are fallible. We all have much room to grow in every way, shape, and form. And as soon as you sort of state a stance where you're at an end point and you know everything from that end point, you're in very dangerous territory, even if you're cloaking it with humanitarianism and rationalism and all these other great values, which actually are great values whose brand's been totally diluted by all of that rhetoric. David Griscom chief financial correspondent. It's been a couple of weeks since we've heard, although I will say I'm going to this Jordan Peterson conference in Idaho in a couple of weeks, and Richard Wolff will be there. I don't know how I'm going to handle it. I don't know how I'm supposed to, frankly, have your back and keep things civil.
Well, you're going to have to watch your back, I think.
Oh, I'm not worried about that, buddy. Should be worried about what paper gets slipped to who. I'm going to just sit. We're like, Wolf and I are just going to be sitting, like, having coffee. And he's going to be like, if you want to go to the Economics and Democracy Conference, you know what you have to do. And I just step up. I just, like, slide in a dress underneath his latte. And then I look wistfully into the distance as a bomb is planted in your building. It's like a scene in Narcos. All right, go ahead, David. Yes.
All right, well, I want to talk about a very specific problem this week. In fact, a $1.5 trillion problem, and that is student loan debt. I was thinking about that, especially after, I don't know if people were familiar, but this week some very disappointing news came out. A lot of folks, especially people who have gone to college in the past decade, have been sort of offered this opportunity where if they go into public service for 10 years and they make faithful payments on their student loans, that they'll be forgiven. And this was something that, caught the fancy of many people. Well, this is the first year that, this program is available for folks who've been working in public service for the past 10 years to have their loans forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Out of 100% of applicants, 99% were rejected by the Department of Education.
Of course.
In fact, only 99 people in total, I believe, were accepted. So there are many reasons that the Department of Education has claimed for why this is happening, being people misfiling their paperwork, people not understanding the parameters of the program.
We are fascists.
Exactly. Well, and the problem is that, the program itself doesn't seem to make a lot of sense even to the bureaucrats within the government. There's been conflicting statements from the Department of Education on what it takes to qualify for it, and even their own people within the administration seem to not really understand how it works. But this leads us to a larger problem than just, these folks who, definitely should have their loans forgiven, but the fact of how many people in this country are crushed under student loan debt. As I said a second ago, it's a $1.5 trillion problem. Now, that's bigger than credit card debt, and it's also bigger than auto loans in this country. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about a very significant part of the economy that is sort of weighed down, and a very specific generational issue. Because the average cost of debt for students in the past 20 years has increased exponentially. Now, we're looking at, average debt load in 2016 was over $37,000 for students. I mean, that's enough to start a small business. That's enough to, put a first payment on a house. I mean, that's a significant
lot of money.
Dampening on the U.S. economy. On top of it, the delinquency rate in the U.S. is around 11.2% in 2017. So that means that people aren't even able to make their payments. And these payments are huge, by the way. We're talking about an average payment that's around $300.
Oh, yeah. I've been in that position of trying to negotiate, a lower number a month in the past, and they're just like, no.
Yeah.
You just push it off. If you can't meet a minimum pretty high threshold, they're not interested.
Well, and then it's like for example, if you go on forbearance because of a new, financial changes, you can see all of the payments that you made just disappear in a year. Yep. Because of interest.
Yep.
I mean, it's absolutely crushing. And it's one of those things that it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, if you look at other countries that, don't offer this kind of predatory practices when it comes to higher education, you have, better outcomes in general. And, one thing that I just want to talk about is if you want to talk about a way to stimulate the economy, forgiving student loan debt is an incredible way to start.
Yep.
Not only is it something that will take the burden off of people's backs, it will allow them to be able to spend their money in more productive ways rather than just servicing the interest payment on loans, which is a huge industry that really doesn't do very much that is productive for our society. On top of
it's a parasite industry.
Without a doubt, it's a parasite industry. Yeah. And on top of that, it really changes the way that higher education is thought of in this country. And we got to think about sort of structurally what college education and the promise that the loan programs that we had was that we had an upper class in the United States, but we had an upper class because they worked harder and they were smarter. Now we had a change, which is more the technocratic change, was we can open up the universities to people of more working class backgrounds. Well, more and more we've seen that a college degree, while it gives you opportunities that you wouldn't have without a college degree, it is not a guarantee of entrance into the middle class. In fact, it's far more likely, even when controlling for college education, if you come from wealth, that you're going to find more opportunities to become wealthy. And if you come from a poor background, even with a higher education degree, you're very unlikely to be able to break into those higher thresholds of earning. So what's happened with college education is more and more people are fighting for it to be just like an ongoing 4 years of job training, right? Which is not something that's necessarily even very healthy for, you know, the intellectual life in the United States. And having, you know, college and universities accessible to all people, where people can learn about literature, art, and philosophy, would just make for a better society overall. It makes your conversations better. It makes your interactions with people better. And it allows for the kind of critical thinking that we very much are lacking in this country, because in general, most people go to college and they're so stressed out because they understand the amount of debt that they're taking, that the only thing that they can do is something that's directly career oriented. Right. And, you know, higher university is higher education is one of the, you know, the glories of our civilization, of human achievement, and it's been so cheapened by this for-profit system. You know, if we want a better society and a more educated society and a more prosperous society, we need to end the system that exploits the hopes of young people and exploits them for profit.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's pretty insane.
Did something happen?
It's pretty insane the way we have 17-year-olds sign on the dotted line for loans of that size.
Well, especially when you think about the for-profit schools, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, but they're absolutely frightening, where these people go to online schools and rack up $45,000, $50,000 in debt, being told that this is, you know, their opportunity to make it.
Or people who think they follow some like path of low-income work because they expect that that's going to qualify them for these forgiveness things, and then you realize you've been doing that and you're not even going to get credit for them.
You know, I have to say, after college I took a job at a nonprofit, and it was good work, but it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do, and it wasn't a huge decision, but I remember having that thought in my head. It's like, oh no, if I you know, don't work in this industry anymore, I'm not going to have the loan forgiveness that I was sort of hoping for. And I made the decision to jump, but I can't imagine I was thinking, you know, 8 years, or even now, after reading this, how furious I would be, realizing that, you know, years of my life that I'd spent, you know, working towards a certain goal were being, you know, taken away. Yeah.
Did that shoot? That button's fucked, huh?
The button's messed up when I let go, so it just means I need to talk. For
just keep going. The button's like, we need more.
We go through so many of these goddamn buttons.
We really do. They must be made in China.
I got to tell you what, Astatic.
Astatic is literally the name of it?
Well, Astatic, but I'll put another S in there just because they're being so bad.
Fucking Astatic, dude. What I've always wondered is, like, what would, if, like, that would be a very interesting, like, what if there was a reframe? I mean, I've certainly been in student loan delinquency, right? I think many people have. If that was something that was, like, if that could be flipped from, you know, people are hounded and financially unable, to there was like a collective, like, we're actually not doing this as a form of civil disobedience.
Like a debt strike?
Yeah, we're doing a debt strike. Instead of like, we can't do it, but there was just a bunch of people who was like, we choose not to do this because this is fundamentally exploitative, abusive, and unfair.
Yeah, you giving our education to bankers to collect interest on was fucked up. We're not playing by that.
Yeah. And this wasn't, and certainly this wasn't right. And this wasn't all the, like, this wasn't spelled out exactly when you were, you know, but even regardless of whether it was spelled out or not, like,
yeah, well, and
I always wonder where there's interventions where it's like, what if something that's just an obvious social and economic ill could actually just get reframed as like, no, we're actually just taking collective action here.
Well, you know, definitely would be something that's good. You know, the problem with student loans and that kind of activism, I think, you know, it's definitely something I support, but the power that these student loan companies have.
They have huge power. You know, they garnish your wages.
They can garnish your wages.
Into your bank account.
And the fact that, you know, you cannot declare bankruptcy with your student loans. I mean, that's absolutely wild to think that, somebody who opens up like the most bizarre business ever, just like completely, waste of money for 50,000, 60,000 can, declare bankruptcy and, have some
You can create like a
respite.
beanie shop and declare bankruptcy.
Yeah, but somebody going
you
to
can't just-
college
right.
and finding out that it wasn't financially the best decision for them, and understanding the punishment that you get for declaring bankruptcy, by the way, that's not something that just makes things go away.
Right.
But the fact that you don't have that option, I mean, it's absolutely disgusting, and that's why it's so hard to fight against. And it's really just morally unconscionable as a society and as a government that we continue to allow this system. And it's incredible, and it's to the Democrats' deficit that they have not made the student loan forgiveness a major part of their platform, because that's something a lot of people can
Utterly
understand.
bizarre.
And people,
I mean, if you want to, there was like endless navel gazing about motivating young voters. I mean, of course, the broader, Medicare for all, for younger people and for parents, obviously free college, but like mass student loan, like just student loan jubilee. Yeah. If you convinced students, if you convinced people in their 20s, 30s, 40s that you could have a policy mechanism to discharge their student loans or chop them in half, are you kidding me?
No, exactly.
That's a lot of votes.
I can't. I don't understand why it's not a major part of their strategy. And the thing is that it would also it would be good for the economy in general. Like, it would just be better if people were not spending $300, $400, $500 a month servicing loans, and instead spending that on consumer goods, or spending that, or even hell, saving it. The fact that so many people can't even afford, a $400 emergency, but are forced to make student loan payments is,
Right.
is absolutely, it's really disgusting.
It's absolutely disgusting. I'm navigating here. Daniel Bessner is outside, but I don't think. Could somebody go out and find him? I think he's on. I'm confirming that he's on our floor.
Okay, I'll go find him.
But yeah, maybe go. Yeah, like Chris comes like, yeah, I got it. I'll find him. But no, I don't. I mean, that must be just some type of another like fucking dumb polling move or something. It must just be like, oh yeah, well, we don't know that people will get out to vote on that, so we're not going to center it. That's really the only reason I can imagine, because it seems to me that is a give me in terms of motivating people on getting rid of student loans.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess there's some people who the only pushback I've ever gotten is people who are like, well, I've paid a lot of student loans. Why should I not? I've already paid those, which I don't really buy, because I sort of feel like the bubble is new enough, right? Like, I feel like it really, Griscom would know this better than I did, but the student loan levels really started peaking mid-2000s, right?
Right.
So, like, it's not like you would have all these people who were from the mid-90s that had these huge debt levels that are going to feel like they got, I don't know.
Also,
Yeah,
what
but
is
they-
that?
they
What is
were
also
also-
what is that logic like?
Well,
Yeah, it's dumb.
who gives a fuck?
They were at their worst, just to get this out there, they were actually at their worst and highest around 2007, 2008.
Right.
But what's really striking about the student loan bubble in general is that it expanded during the recession while all other types of loans dwindled. So during the past 8 years, it's really
Well,
expanded.
a bunch of people tried to escape to graduate school.
I chose
Yeah.
because I was a freshman when I think in 2007, and I chose to I'm like, I think I might do grad school.
Right.
And
No, a lot of
makes
people.
sense,
No,
yeah.
in that time period, that was a ton of people did that, because that was like that you would escape. And also and it didn't sink in either that it would be like a structural feature of the economy, even in a recovery. So people went and they gobbled up like law degrees, which, things like that, which weren't great calls. Daniel Bessner is here. We're going to take a brief break. What are we going to do for break music now, Matt?
Well, we
With
can
these
do
YouTube
this one if we just do
mothers.
it quickly. This
All right. I'm going to go. I need to run
Okay.
for a second. So let's, if you need to switch it up, and then we will be right back. We're talking about what a socialist foreign policy actually looks like, and also throwing a lot of shots. Daniel has a whole list of people that he would like to start some beef with. So I was surprised, but I'm just following the lead of my guest. All right. We'll be back soon. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Daniel Bessner. He is the Anne I'm reading the whole thing.
Thank you.
He is the Ann A.H. and Kenneth B. Pyle Assistant Professor in American Foreign Policy in the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. We actually had a really good conversation about this book on the Majority Report a couple months ago. Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. It's been fun and then you had this piece that we'll also obviously talk about in the New York Times of sort of charting what would an actual left foreign policy look like. And I want us to deal with the left foreign policy. I want us to talk about the think tank component, how foreign policy is actually made. Matt, I don't know if you need another minute. You got it? But I wanted to start, I want to just take two different issues. We'll take them one by one that we've been covering on this show. Obviously, people will laugh. This is another Brazil segment we're going to do. I want to play this clip. Bernie Sanders just put out this segment on his YouTube channel. It's with Danny Glover and Mark Weisbrot about the situation in Brazil. It's particularly important. We're about a week away from the first round of elections, and the polls that came out today look really bad. Haddad had a lot of momentum. Bolsonaro, the fascist candidate, is shooting back up. And another thing that happened this week, just briefly, to really underline the judicial coup nature of this, Lula had finally been granted an ability to do an interview with a newspaper. Now, in Brazil, incarcerated cartel heads give TV interviews, and they've totally blocked press access to him in terms of giving interviews. He was authorized the right to give an interview by one Supreme Court justice, and another Supreme Court justice immediately stepped in and intervened and blocked the interview. And just sort of they're really showing their hands here in terms of what they're actually up to. And you just got back from Brazil, so you'll tee off on it. But first, let's just play a little bit of this video that Bernie Sanders put out with Danny Glover and Mark Weisbrot.
The threat to democracy in Brazil is a result of the enormous achievements of the Workers' Party.
Brazil has an election on October 7th, and this is a very big election for a number of reasons. This one is a really unusual election because, first of all, the most popular candidate, the former President Lula da Silva, is in jail, and he would have won the election by all the polls if he had been allowed to run.
In the first decade of the 21st century, they reduced poverty, they had a vibrant economy, they extended their relationship with other countries in Latin America.
The Workers' Party was first elected to the presidency with Lula in 2002, and then he was re-elected, and then he could only serve 2 consecutive terms. And so in 2010, one of his ministers, Dilma Rousseff, ran, and she won, and then she won again in 2014. Now that period was a very successful period for social and economic progress in Brazil. And then in 2015, there was a recession, and the right-wing opposition parties to Dilma, who was in office, took advantage of that, and they impeached her. They didn't really have a crime. They accused her of a kind of an accounting manipulation, which all previous presidents had done, and governors too. It was a power grab, but then they still had the problem that Lula could run for president. So with a very politicized judiciary, they went after Lula, and he was convicted of taking a bribe, which was in the form of repairs to an apartment, basically. And they never showed that he owned or stayed in the apartment or rented it, or that it was his in any legal way. They didn't have any material evidence either.
We have to do something about this. But we at the same time understand that this is not only just happening in Brazil, it's being undermined in other countries in the region as well. The question about what has happened to all of these governments in the region who introduced policies that were more friendly to poor people and friendly to indigenous people. What is happening to those particular countries, and certainly those leaders who initiated those really progressive changes.
The leading candidate is this congressman, Jair Bolsonaro. In the press, they compare him to Trump, but to be honest, that's actually unfair to Trump because he is so extremist and so openly racist and misogynist.
Well, that's the nightmare. basically. What he represents is the same kind of ideology of Donald Trump. He's extremely to the right. He certainly has attacked not only African religions, he's also called for the intervention of the military as well.
You have to remember this country is a relatively new democracy. It's only 30-something years since the dictatorship.
Progressives have to be concerned not only what is happening here in the United States, but also concerned about those who are progressive in other countries in Latin America as well. And certainly Brazil is one of those progressive forces.
So I think that's just tee off on it. I mean, first of all, what do you make of that timeline and being in Brazil, and also you were nodding your head at the regional implications of this too?
Well, it's really interesting because, of course, Latin America's had this pink tide over the last 20 or 30 years, and now this is sort of the reaction to that, right? And so there's this long history in Latin America. So as Danny said, I have to say I'm with Danny here, but the military dictatorship from 64 to 85, and so you have this new democracy in 85, which has been having a lot of transitional problems and, of course, existing in this capitalist world. And so I think it's just really important to emphasize how this might have broader implications for the entire region, right? So it's a reaction to the Chavez, the Lula sort of pink tide of the 1990s and 2000s. So it's really something that Americans need to pay attention to.
Even as they're really different ideologically inside it.
Oh, very much so, but sort of a more people's progress and focusing on poor people and indigenous people and trying to combat poverty as opposed to doing things like giving air conditioning to the subway, right? So you go to Brazil and the actual residential spaces are very run down. There's a lot of, we could curse on here, I believe, a lot of shit all over the place, right? So the government has, instead of focusing on that for actual working people, it's focused on giving air conditioning to the subway. And you could see sort of the corruption involved with this right-wing coup that's recently happened with Dilma.
After they got rid of Dilma, this Temer government's imposed really vicious austerity.
It's really terrible. And so, of course, what happened was the fascist candidate was stabbed in the state of Minas Gerais, actually, when I was there. And that has really led to an increase in popular support for him. So it's sort of the worst of all worlds here.
But yet at the same time, it's also Lula has this sort of sustained popularity, and the Workers' Party's actually won the last 4 elections in a row because they actually know how to do this.
Exactly, and there's Lula Livre stuff all over the place, literally all over the place. You could see Free Lula propaganda, which is great, and good propaganda messages, and also the name of the activist who was killed. I forget.
Marina.
Yes,
De Silva, right? Marina Silva. I need to.
Right?
Marielle Franco. Excuse me. Marina Silva is actually a terrible presidential candidate in Brazil. Marielle Franco was an assassinated city councilwoman who they've still not identified who assassinated her.
Right. And so there's a lot of grassroots support for that, but it's interesting as sort of the bourgeois opposition has coalesced around this really far-right figure, much more far-right than Trump, in my opinion, because he has an actual ideology.
Do you think that also has to do with, last week on the show, I criticized this sort of free-floating anti-corruption discourse and how it gets weaponized by the right?
Absolutely, because that's what they used to get rid of Lula, right? So it's what is corruption? Who defines corruption, right? It's always that's the question, right? So helping working people is defined as corruption, while sort of Wall Street banking is not, right? And so it's all about definitions and who's the power elite there. I completely agree.
Let's touch on one other. Let's go to Yemen. We're refueling, United States and UK. I mean, it's kind of funny the way it's presented in the media, because in some ways it's like, well, we're refueling these Saudi UAE missions, so we're sort of supporting it. But the reality is that my understanding is, first of all, that they would not have the capacity to do what they were doing. So it's not just sort of like support staff. We're co-equal or highly co-active participants in just a slaughter.
Absolutely. I mean, the United States really since 1945 has armed the world. And this actually relates to Brazil. Brazil is one of the most armed countries in the world. And where do you think they get their weapons from? So this
You're
is
talking about small arms too, right?
Yeah, no, small arms, right? You're worried if someone's worried about getting robbed. I actually saw a robbery there firsthand, one of the first times that I did. The first time, and it's just people are afraid about getting shot with handguns, right? And where do you think those guns come from?
Right.
So this is a kind of secret history of the United States, that all of the violence that we see, and we see these countries as dysfunctional or whatever the case may be, but they're fighting with U.S. arms.
And what do you think could be done in terms of Yemen?
I mean, what I would do is immediately stop funding the Saudis. And what critics or what sort of bourgeois or right-wing critics would say, then what do you do about oil, right? If you sort of tear asunder the U.S.-Saudi relationship, that would affect oil prices. And I think this is how we have to think of a left foreign policy as encompassing also domestic policy. We do things like invest in alternative energy, right? Because right now we're on a very restricted foreign policy program because our own economic policies, backward-looking reactionary policies, really lend themselves to the support of dictators, like in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere throughout the world.
Before we we're going to get to this New York Times piece with your sort of basic outline for kind of what a left foreign policy would look like. But before we do that, I do want to talk more about this Democracy in Exile book. It's a fascinating book.
Thanks.
Partially because to me, there's some things that maybe we could actually learn from it in terms of how people sort of come together and build an intellectual infrastructure about how to look at the world, basically. Obviously, our goals and what we're trying to do are diametrically opposed to the people you're writing about, but they still maybe have some useful guidebooks for us. But first of all, could you, explain, who is this guy, Hans Speer? And where does this come from? What is the rise of the defense intellectual?
Sure. So actually, Hans Speer was a guy who was on the left wing of the Social Democratic Party of Germany during the era of the Weimar Republic, basically the democratic German state before Hitler. And over the course of the 1920s, he progressively lost faith in Marxist theory because, and he wasn't wrong here, Germany's workers essentially, to some real degree, supported anti-democratic movements, whether it be on the right, like the fascists, or even on the left with the communists, who were anti-democratic, right? This is Leninist vanguardism. And over the course of the 30s, he began to argue that intellectuals needed to become essentially the handmaidens of power and use their research skills and use their knowledge in order to build a defense of democracy against extremist threats. And he helped build institutions like the Rand Corporation, which were essentially designed to permanently remove the public from the foreign policy making process. So it's this transition from social democracy to what I would consider to be a right-wing, hawkish American foreign policy.
So what are the three components of that? Is it the trauma of dealing with Nazism, which you talk about? Is it this notion that there's an objective world that can only be apprehended by experts? Or is this actually, is this Plato philosopher king stuff?
There's elements of all of that, but it comes from the idea that modernity is simply too complex for ordinary people to understand. And the fear is that ordinary people who don't want to do things like, remember, there was a strong isolationist movement in the 1930s, didn't want to fight fascism. And after the World War II, there's the fear that ordinary people wouldn't be able to commit themselves to what was seen as the existential struggle against Soviet communism. So the idea was you create what is essentially a shadow state where the public or even the Congress doesn't really have an effect on foreign policy making. So a place like the Rand Corporation, which is essentially
Explain to Rands to people.
Sure. So the Rand Corporation is really the first national security think tank. And what I think is really important about it is that its builders consciously put it not in the American state. It's technically a private organization, but it's totally disconnected from the public. It's totally disconnected from Congress. So you essentially have the research arm of the American empire, the people who are suggesting to the policymakers what they should actually do, having no democratic accountability whatsoever. The people have no way to sanction or even really know what Rand is doing. And this is also, of course, connected to the rise of what historians term a culture of classification, right? We don't even know what our own country is doing in the world because everything is classified, right? So it's the idea that a wise American foreign policy is one in which the public and the Congress don't have an effect. And you could even see it on as basic a level as education. So whoever is listening, how many people in high school learn that America has hundreds of bases overseas, right? So the idea is that the public is completely disconnected from this huge imperial infrastructure that really governs the world, and that's linked to this fear that the public isn't going to be able to make a wise foreign policy that emerged from this belief that the public voted for Hitler, they may not want to fight World War II, you can't trust them to beat Stalin, etc.
Is the history, and not to be like exculpatory, but is the history of like German support for Hitler and the Nazi Party? Is it a little bit more complicated?
Oh, of course it's more complicated.
Okay.
It's
not that we're going to let Germans off the hook. Obviously.
No, you don't.
'Cause, fuck Germans, obviously. No, I'm just kidding. But no, is it? I mean, just because there was that book that came out decades ago. What is it called?
Hitler's Willing Executioners.
Right. So there's that like public perception that that feeds into this, that this whole country just like en masse was ready to buy into the the most horrifying genocidal. Yeah.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I think there's elements of truth in both sides, where it's absolutely true that not every German was a member of the Nazi Party and not every German was a virulent anti-Semite. But it's also true that German labor was one of the first groups to be co-opted by the Nazi state. So it's important to take the critiques seriously, but my big criticism of people like Speyer was that they turned this contingent historical experience, Germany after World War I lost this major war, depression, et cetera, the creation of a totally new state, and turned it into a universal referendum on the capacity for ordinary people to serve as democratic decision makers. And I think that's the real problem, this universality of a very contingent historical experience.
So then, and how does this defense think tank and public intellectual infrastructure parallel the like literal policy apparatus? We have like the Dulles brothers running wilds and just laying to waste Africa, Latin America, Asia. We have the rise of the arms and defense industry, and this same circle that actually even in obviously this guy's more sympathetic as this kind of like world weary German intellectual who had a trauma and seriously miscalculated, but now we have John Bolton fits this mold, right? Like we have this network of think tanks and intellectuals that are funded by defense contractors and also coalesce with the military and intelligence appetites.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think this really highlights the importance of institutions to American foreign policy making. So in my view, all of the institutions that were essentially coalesced in the 1947 National Security Act, the National Security Council, which is how Kissinger comes to power, right? Or Walt Rostow comes to power, the CIA, and even the very Department of Defense are essentially institutions that are designed to, one, manage this emerging American imperium, for lack of a better phrase, and two, be able to respond immediately to to perceived crises throughout the world. Because the fear was that the fight with the Soviet Union is this existential crisis, especially after 1949 when the Soviets get an atomic bomb. So democracies, which were traditionally maligned as being slow to react, you actually have to go through Congress and things like that. There was created an institutional infrastructure that was created essentially to allow democracies to respond in non-democratic ways. The president could immediately send troops, or the CIA could do subversion in the Italian and French elections of 1948. So these institutions are crisis institutions, and you really see that not only throughout the Cold War, but after the Cold War ended, right? Why did these institutions, which were designed and built to fight the Cold War, continue to exist? Because there's institutional inertia, and you see this with the new identification of an existential enemy like what Michael Flynn calls radical Islam, or what Lindsey Graham calls radical Islam. So you defeat the Soviet Union, and then there's another existential enemy, which provides a logic for these institutions to keep on doing what they're going to do. For example, to deploy special forces to 149 countries in 2017, right? Things like that.
Right. And so now let's shift gears and go over this list that you published in the New York Times. It was about a week ago.
Yeah, a week or two ago.
Of the sort of 5 different components of what a left foreign policy would look like. You want to just run those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea was that I didn't want to describe or prescribe actual specific foreign policies, because I think that's for the grassroots and the leaders of the left to work out on their own, but really to identify a series of principles that I think could be used to sort of serve as lodestones for what a left foreign policy can be. So the first one is democracy. And what I really mean by that is bringing Congress, but even more than that, the people back into the foreign policy making process, developing some mechanism that allows ordinary Americans to actually have a say and even more importantly, some knowledge of what the United States is doing abroad. So that's the first point. The second point is accountability, right? That you need the foreign policy professionals who do things like start the Iraq War they shouldn't, to take one example of Paul Wolfowitz, and then become president of the World Bank. And then once you resign from the World Bank in disgrace, go to the AEI. And then once you're at the AEI, become one of the head foreign policy makers of Jeb Bush's foreign policy team, right? So everyone thought Bush was going to win, so people were planning to have Wolfowitz back in power, which to me is rather wacky. And if you don't have accountability, you're going to keep on making the very same mistakes. Number 3 is anti-militarism, which is just to recognize that the United States has this enormous base system, really 800 bases, or by some counts 1,000 bases. You know, all these aircraft carriers that have the capacity to destroy the world 20 times over. That these sorts of bases and forces should be withdrawn, should be drawn down. That we should stop spending a ridiculous amount of money and what is essentially oftentimes graft, and in other times basically unusable weapons or pointless weapons, and bring it back to social welfare systems. Right. The 4th one I think is really critical, and that's the notion of threat deflation. Like I said, since 1945, the United States has really been moving from crisis to crisis. First the Soviet Union, then so-called radical Islam, and then North Korea and Iran. And really, I think it's important to emphasize that none of these powers, none of these threats pose a serious existential threat to the United States. Now, the United States may very well at some point be the victim of a terrorist attack, but to me, that's more a consequence of living in an interconnected world. It's a consequence of modernity that you can't really ever fully defend against. And so Americans need to understand that we're really safe, and we have to stop spending so much money on these ridiculous base systems and trying to manage the world. And then the fifth point, I think, is really the one that opens up for us a lot of discussion, which is internationalism. And what does the left mean by internationalism, right? Are we going to start doing humanitarian interventions? I don't think we should. But I think we need to think about what ways do we interact in the world on 2 levels. First, let's say Bernie wins. What did the leftists who actually control state power do? What do they do with those mechanisms? But even more importantly, we might be concerned with what I've started to call the foreign policy of civil society, right? Which is, what do NGOs, what do movements like DSA, what's their foreign policy? How do they build transnational solidarities with working class movements abroad and relate that to state power, but not be totally reliant on it? So, for example, I wouldn't want Bernie to start funding organizations because, let's say, the next Trump wins and he starts funding right-wing organizations, right? So we need to think about ways to separate state foreign policy from, again, the foreign policy of civil society.
And so could this also involve, like you've talked about as an example, just sort of like banning certain types of corporate behavior abroad?
Right. And I think we need to move away from what I would call the consumer capitalism that has defined American capitalism since at least the 1960s, which is the idea that consumption is the center of what it means to be a human being, and that we have to actually make the argument as the left that Americans may have to, for a time, give up some of their consumptive habits in order to create a more just world where it's not defined by the types of hierarchies where the global north sits at the top and totally dominates the global south. And we have iPhones that rely on this horrible labor and all the things we're very aware of. But we need to make that argument that consumption shouldn't be the center of what it means to be a human being. And
so it's so funny because I am curious, like, how China, like as an example, fits into this in terms of just a world where the dynamic is going to be absolutely different. And China has, I think some of its own really negative appetites.
Absolutely.
In terms of foreign policy. And I think people shouldn't be naive about that either. At the same time, I don't want to fall into the cliche, because that's the other problem with these conversations is they immediately succumb to cliche. Like, what about the rise of China with regards to a left foreign policy?
Right. But
nonetheless, what about it?
I think that's absolutely an important thing to emphasize. And I think that so to me, the question is security transition in East Asia, right? The United States is not going to be there forever. And even though some people of the older generation are essentially arguing that we should be there for 200 years in East Asia and the South China Sea, defend Japan, defend South Korea, I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think that should be the responsibility of the United States. Now, the question is, what does a security transition look like?
Right.
And the left needs to grapple with these non-easy questions. Do we just leave South Korea and Japan to Chinese hegemony, right? Is that what the left wants to do? It very well might be. What I would argue is that the state itself doesn't stay in sort of the Eastern Hemisphere forever, but that grassroots, again, the foreign policy of civil society works on building these types of transnational solidarities where we could work to create a just world. However, we do, I think, need to recognize the limits of American power in an era when the United States, for example, doesn't control 50% of industrial production like it did in 1945. Just the reality is we don't have the powers that we did earlier in our history.
And what about in a play like in Africa, where there's sort of like this multi-colonial play right now, right? Like where it's these different models, and China's going in incredibly aggressively, and of course the United States still has extractive, abusive relations. Would that be a place where, because one thing that I've said in the sort of pushback of conversations I get into, where it's, I mean, and I think it goes without saying that, like, of course, the U.S. Western security system is incredibly exploitive and abusive, and anybody with, I think, even the most soft left politics would want to leave that world behind categorically. And then at the same time, like, as I always say, like, when you're an activist in, say, I don't know, Cameroon, you can exploit contradictions in the United States potentially. You could say, like, well, the foreign policy of the United States is essentially obviously directed by extractive industries and arms manufacturers, and that really is the engine. And then there's all these sort of, crazy hegemonic theories of military presence and expanded kinetic activity. But then there is also like civil society organizations who are concerned about various issues in Africa, as an example. There might even be people inside the State Department who are, writing reports that are indirectly criticizing what the rest of the apparatus of the government is doing. In China, as an example, like, there isn't the same, like, it's like, oh, well, we put labor organizers in jail here too. Right. Like, go fuck yourself. There's no contradiction to play off of. So it's like, but maybe if I understand what you're saying correctly, which is interesting, is that the only way actually to properly even begin to respond to that type of like mercantilist neo-colonial situation is actually to completely give up our own way of doing that business and properly get on the other side of a power equation, if that's possible.
Well, I think there's always going to be trade-offs, right? And some of these trade-offs are absolutely going to be tragic. I mean, the problem is, if I had my druthers, I would totally stop every genocide and humanitarian and save everyone in the world.
Right. I mean, in this case, just even talking about like literally labor abuses, as an example, right? Like, where maybe there's more room in terms of, I don't know, exerting diplomatic power or who we back on the ground or align with or so on.
Right. And I think this is what these sort of civil society and NGO organizations could do, which could actually help identify people on the ground, people that respond to the values of the left, and help build them up in whatever capacities are possible. I don't think this should be military. And this is why I'm wary about making it a state-directed project, even though the American state obviously, of course, has awesome power, is that it just historically has lent itself to such destruction. Even with people who had truly great and noble intentions, it just never works out. We don't understand what's actually happening on the ground. We don't understand the power coalitions. We don't know what'll happen. So I'm just generally loath, given the history of the United States after 1945, to promote state-directed projects.
Yeah.
But this is why the left needs to build. We need to think in terms of movement politics, right? It's not just electoralism, and it's not just grassroots. It's thinking of the left as a larger movement where certain elements are able to do certain things and other elements do other things, right? And the state may have certain limited capacities, but we as people who are trying to build these sorts of working class transnational solidarities begin to create our own foreign policy where we're able to connect with people on the ground in a real way that someone from the State Department will just never be able to do by dint of their position.
What is national security? Does that exist?
Well, this is really interesting, and it's a good question, right? And this really leads to my argument that the national security state and this whole idea of American empire is a capital P progressive project. And what I mean is that refers to a very specific historical movement roughly between 1880 and 1920, which is the idea that you could create categories like the economy, which is probably the most famous one, or national security, which is this abstracted pseudo-social scientific concept that you're able to manage, right? That you're able to measure national security. It goes up or it goes down. You have more or less security. So I think that that's kind of a naive epistemology and way to understand how the world actually works. So no, I wouldn't say national security is actually a real thing, but it does have real effects as a category, just like the economy has real effects. Like the idea of a macroeconomy is essentially a little wild, that you're able to sort of create this incredibly abstract category that you could manipulate by doing A and then B will happen, right? It doesn't really work that way. It's essentially a human heuristic, and this is what national security is. So it's an organizing analytic concept that people have used to talk about things like defense. And if I had my wish, the left would sort of move beyond the security discourse, which I really think limits our politics and actually prevents against transformative projects of the type that I at least would like to see in the world, by promoting a conservative, almost reactionary politics where you could only defend national security, which is in some sense a negative project, as opposed to build a more positive world.
Right. And also, like, whose security?
Exactly.
Right. Like, because that's, I mean, when you talk about it as not being a monolithic block, I mean, like, okay, I guess there's some very obvious things. We could say we can't have a perfectly safe world, but we could all agree that nobody wants, a bomb to go off in Midtown Manhattan. That's terrible for everybody. Okay. So that's a very narrow, limited claim that we could all safely agree to. But beyond that, you start getting into everything from, well, what about the blowback from all of these, wars and kinetic activities we pursue overseas? I don't think that's benefiting us. What about the rules we're writing that might increase the likelihood of the spread of infectious diseases because we're undermining, developing countries' ability to distribute generic drugs on behalf of our pharmaceutical industry? What does that mean?
I mean, I think you're right. There are absolutely a ton of unintended consequences and types of blowback that we'll get. And also, as you indicated, security really has a tendency to sort of gobble up everything, where everything could be justified in the name of security. So, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, the intervention in Libya, what's going on in Yemen right now, right. Whether we do or don't act in Syria, and we actually have been acting since 2011, even though most people don't know about that. Right. So I think this logic of security really becomes all overwhelming, and it really becomes the criterion by which all political actions, especially foreign policy behavior, is judged, and that might not necessarily be the best way to think about things. So, for example, an alternative heuristic would be justice and global justice, right? Why don't we make that the measurement of what we do in the world as opposed to security? Americans, and I'm not exactly sure why, but they desire a risk-free world, right? There's almost a cultural sense that we can't talk about the fact that we're going to die. And I think this actually has a lot of reason, just to relate it to a slightly different topic, of gerontocracy, right? Why do we have so many old politicians, like people who are above 70, above 75, even above 80? Dianne Feinstein, I believe, is 85, and Grassley is 85, something like that. Because we don't have a sense of talking about death in this country and sort of the fact that we can't live forever, right? So it's kind of a general cultural American problem, the acceptance of risk and the acceptance of literally death. It's a cultural problem that I think we need to think more seriously about on the left.
I'm not going to die. So
neither am I.
Yeah, totally. Just going to blow right past that. No, I think that's actually really interesting. But on the other hand, there's this enormous fear of death. But then on the other hand, this like incredible comfort with outsourcing death, whether we're slaughtering Native Americans or Vietnamese people or Yemenis. Like, as long as it's sort of out there, we can just lay waste.
And even in a more direct sense, I mean, since the creation of an all-volunteer force in the early 1970s, I believe 73, essentially the bourgeoisie has outsourced death to poor Southerners, often of Black or Latinx background. Right. So there's actually a literal outsourcing of death, so that people like Brett Kavanaugh never had a fear of getting drafted, but it's a poor person in rural Georgia who's going to fight the bourgeoisie's wars abroad. So in many senses, we've outsourced death, and even more recently, we've essentially started to privatize the military, where so many of our wars are actually for people who are veterans of the American military and then work for defense contractors. And so they're not even included in our understanding of what America does abroad. We've essentially created a new class of mercenaries, much like the Roman Empire, much like the empires throughout medieval Europe. We have a class of mercenaries that fights our wars, and so there's no even consciousness amongst the American populace of what the hell the country is doing in the world.
Right. Let alone the elite.
Which does nothing.
Which I guess is why they still get that, like, a contact high from being in the same room as John McCain or something.
Exactly. Or where John McCain's daughter Meghan McCain could dare critique socialism.
We're big fans of hers here.
We went to college together.
Oh, you did?
I didn't know her, but we were in college at the same time. But this fact that she has the gall to critique socialism and say they're playing with other people's money, right?
Her life is literally other people's money.
Her life is, and literally other people. Her life has been has been promoted by the American war machine on one hand, and I believe alcohol on the other hand. Right?
Yes, beer.
So So
I like beer. I like beer.
Who doesn't these days? He's a great man, a great American. But yeah, so we're living in this absurd world. It's really upside down, where the values of this country are just topsy-turvy right now.
Before we get to the post game, and you're going to hang out with us post game.
Sure.
What about the European project? Is that the sort of like, because it did seem like there was certainly a time where, for all of the hypocrisies and contradictions, and let's not even, like, we can go there in a second, that like European progress is achieved in this sort of balance between an incredibly privileged place in the global supply chain, which still relies on exploitation, of Africa and Asia and Latin America and so on, and even their own Eastern zone, as we see more and more, right? And that there is something of a U.S. security umbrella, and so they're able to have a period of time where, particularly like late 90s, early aughts, where they're just like, they're investing in their social safety nets, they're moving forward on some, important social issues. And we can point out all the hypocrisies and contradictions and everything that are just sort of endless. And then at the same time, it's like you also have to admit that it's like, hey, of everything that's happened so far, where would it probably be the nicest place to be, right?
No,
like
absolutely.
Probably somewhere in. But now they've ironically, they've essentially like detonated themselves through actually writing in almost like the gold standard into the euro,
right?
Which is, so I mean. But how does the failure, or maybe it's not a full failure yet, fit into this project in terms of like having some type of transnational superstructure that isn't just economic, but theoretically also delivers, ecological and labor and other forms of rights?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think that's important for the left to recognize. Transnational solidarities, even of the horribly elitist type of the European Union, and everything you said, are actually really important, because it's a first step to the world we want to build. And I mean, someone asked me today what my major foreign policy goal would be. What I think we could actually do, for example, is in North America, create a true North American Union where we don't rely on Mexico for essentially cheap labor and exploit that country as we have for, at this point, hundreds of years. To me, the major tragedy of the European Union is that it never had a democratic base, and the elite who designed it never tried to build that democratic base. And I think you're seeing the blowback of that now. There was never a popular democratic base for the European Union, so it was always going to be an inherently limited project, and which was why it was essentially confined to the realm of interstate travel and currency, right? Because those are sorts of these hyper elitist projects, economic projects and travel projects that were able to get done. But the European Parliament was never much. I mean, this is why Silvio Berlusconi, appointed all of these Italian models that he knew to it, because it was kind of a joke, right? And so I think that what this shows is that to build the types of transnational solidarities that you and I want to see in the world, they need to be on a democratic base. They can't be vanguardist and they can't be elitist. And I think that's what the sort of the grenade that the European Union has done to itself has demonstrated.
You said, as a final question here, actually, I want to combine two things because maybe they're contradictory. So one part of me says, what can we, building a left foreign policy, actually learn from these ultra elitist intellectuals? Is there something to learn in terms of how they banded together to generate ideas and kind of map a concept of the world? But then conversely, I've also heard you say, really, really earnestly, in a very good way, that like, especially the first part of the equation of restoring democracy to foreign policy includes just really serious educational projects in getting people to understand the world we're in, and obviously in the United States, the empire we preside over.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So just to take the second question first, what I would do is do things like focus on changing textbooks, right? How could the left inform the Texas textbook industry, right? How could we get discussions of American empire into textbooks? How could we reframe things like the Tea Party not as about anti-taxes, but about economic justice, right? It's just how you tell the story. What is the narrative that you propose? And it's not remaking history. It's just actually looking at history in a different light. And I think that sort of project, the educational project, the left needs to take much more seriously than it has in the past. Now, it has for very understandable reasons. We often don't have funding and things like that. But it's something that I think we need to focus upon. And in terms of what we can learn from people like Hans Speyer, I think it's important, and I go back to sort of Marxism, day one, Marxism 101, is that you need to understand the historical context in which you live. So to me, it's not useful to make analogies, to example, late Imperial Russia in 1917, because the conditions of the United States in 2018 are so different. And so in that sense, this sort of large vanguardist revolt against the state is probably not going to happen. What people like Speyer showed is that intellectuals who are dedicated and who understand the actual structures of power within which they operate are able to change the world. And I think that the left, in that sense, needs to, of course, the base is always the grassroots, it's always the people, and to some degree, it's always the working class. But you also need to have an elitist component, at least in the sense that, let's say Bernie wins in 2020, who the hell is going to staff the National Security Council, right? You need to have an answer to that question, right? Well, me. You need to have basically.
No, I'm going to go there
both
too.
of us, great.
Yeah, excuse me.
So you need to have this.
You just got demoted.
No, I think that's fair. So you need to have a cadre who's able to do that, and that's unfortunately an elitist project and it's hierarchical. But it's just recognizing, at least what I think to be true, is that this is the country in which we live in 2018.
Well, right, and also there's a distinction, I wonder, between this elitist, ridiculous notion that like there's a special breed of people that can think about foreign policy. That's ludicrous. And certainly if you go in even just sort of intuitive reactions to how the world works, I think you can track a whole lot of, like, at least I'll say anecdotally, plenty of people who, I'll just run the stereotype, like, the guy I know that didn't go to college or whatever has a much better instinctual grasp of how things work, at least from my perspective, than plenty of people I know who, have gone to Ivy League colleges. But then conversely, like, most people don't have the time, inclination, or desire to be like an expert on, the inner workings of Iran's parliament.
Right.
And that's fine.
Right.
And as long as they have enough discretion and power to say, don't invade Iran because of some, ridiculous fear-mongering that you're trying to lie to me about, that's the democratic, governance that goes back to people and grassroots always. I don't think there's any scenario, even in the most utopian one, where there isn't some sense of different people taking ownership in a broad sense of different areas, because there's always, different types of expertise levels, desire.
Right.
And that doesn't contradict. It's about, I think, the total evening has to be the access to people having power over domains, not the idea that power wouldn't exist.
Right.
That's when it becomes a fantasy.
Right. No, I agree. And it's all like equality of different types of capital, whether it's literal capital or social capital or culture. Like, we shouldn't value people like Paul Wolfowitz more than we value teachers or whatever.
Right. Well, I mean, in fact, right. And then in the analogy, it would be the positive version of Paul Wolfowitz has the same social capital as a teacher. Paul Wolfowitz, of course, has less value than any teacher, And
then I think this leads to 2 points. So one, you need a mechanism to sort of mediate between this class of experts and the demos in a real way, where the demos actually has sanction power over the class of experts. And I think it's also important for us on the left to really defend learning and knowledge, right? Because if you don't have learning and knowledge, then a great historian once said, then you leave decisions to either habit, to authority of any type, whatever you decide, or chance.
Right.
And we don't want that. We value knowledge and we value learning. We just don't think that makes someone inherently better or best and the brightest in any real sense. And I think we just have to, that seems like a contradiction, but it's actually not. It's kind of just a reality.
Mm-hmm. Like an actual lived reality.
A lived reality.
Like that. It's like, it's very able to say one person has an expertise in a field does not make them a better human being.
Right.
Or a part of a select cadre, right?
Like, and especially given the fact that the experts have fucked up so royally.
Well, right.
So many times, whether it's Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. So we also need to recognize the inherent fallenness, to borrow a Catholic metaphor, of human beings, right?
Yes. I was saying that earlier, and I think now I realize I stole that from you. I'm really into it. I like that. I like that a lot. I'm all about that. What we're going to do is we're going to do a post game. We've got more sound to play. We're going to get to some Discord questions. The Gulag is happening in the post game. The Gulag segment. Our old friend Steve Klubeck returns. He has a book. You know who this guy is?
No.
He's an interesting version of an expert.
He's one of our
he's
one of our favorites.
He's definitely one of our favorites. We're going to actually do a nice little archive dip for the first part of the post game. So this Sunday, illicit history of the elite and tax havens with Megan Day. Woke Bros. There's going to be a new one on Thursday. Friday is a live show at the Bell House, and as I say, just make sure all of your information's in order because it's the first of the month. And if you haven't done it yet, go to patreon.com/TMBS. Thank you for all of the support. We've been doing very well. We're moving towards that 2,000. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Uchiwali, for being in studio. And thank you, Daniel Bessner.
Thank
we'll
you.
Be back in the post game.